Hello, I'm Joel Furchess, and I would like to submit a perspective on how Christianity may interact with my area of research. In order to do so, let me briefly describe the 5 options for the interaction between Christianity and psychology, as outlined by Eric L. Johnson in his 2010 book, Psychology and Christianity: 5 Views. The views Johnson describes are these: biblical counseling, which is the view that therapy and counseling ought to be performed by pastors using biblical principles and divorced from the science of psychology. Interaction, meaning that psychological research ought to be performed but guided by Christian values and principles, such that psychology and Christianity inform one another. Transformational, which is similar to interaction, but with a focus on addressing the spiritual needs and soulical nature of human beings. Christian psychology, which is the view that psychology ought to be done by Christians in a Christian context in order to be reliable and coherent with reality as Christians understand it. The final view described by Johnson is the one I would like to propose as consistent with my area of research. Johnson titles this view Levels of Explanation. Think about when you attend high school or college. You don't stay in a single room talking about life as a whole. You go from period to period, and each of these periods teaches a specific subject. You learn history independent from physics, independent from literature. But just because you're learning the principles of geometry in one room and the techniques of literary criticism in another, it doesn't mean that those two systems contradict one another. They just address very different aspects of reality as a whole. Entangling social studies with astrophysics is unnecessary and possibly unhelpful. There are, as Johnson would describe them, different levels of explanation, meaning that you rely on the subject of cellular biology when you talk about endocrines, and the subject of anthropology when you describe the migration of tribal people in the Amazon basin. These levels interact at some junction, but they only need to both be referenced when talking about that specific junction. So why have I selected this particular approach for my area of research? Let me talk a bit about my research. The subject of my research is religious conversion and deconversion. Now, naturally, one would suppose that the conjunction of conversion research and Christianity is an obvious one, and perhaps should function under one of the other 5 approaches. I will describe to you why that is not the case in a moment, but first, let me talk about the nature of conversion research. Research related to conversion doesn't ask the question, how do people come to know God? Or, in the words of Jesus' disciples, who then can be saved? The subject of conversion research is the fundamental question of, how does one go from one set of beliefs and behaviors to an entirely different set of beliefs and behaviors? While conversion tends to scrutinize religion primarily, these same questions could be asked about a transition between political parties, social groups, philosophical schools of thought, and so on. In fact, the first task of a conversion researcher is to provide a functional definition of the two systems between which the conversion occurs. One does not, for instance, say that Susan went from being a New Ager to being a Christian. One defines the exact behaviors and statements made by Susan prior to the conversion, and the other exact behaviors and statements after the conversion. Conversion research doesn't simply describe where the individual came from and where they went. It is a study of the topology, meaning what did the process or journey look like? Were there stages which mark the transition? And what were they? One also does not focus entirely on Christian conversion. One also looks at conversion to other religions, movements between sects or denomination, and, in my particular area, deconversion from religion to atheism. Now, if the data gathered from this research were to support Christian exceptionalism, these require more scrutiny. But one does not assume Christian exceptionalism at the outset, nor does one offer Christianity as a blanket term. So why did I select levels of explanation as my model for the interaction of Christianity with conversion research? Any other view of psychology and Christianity, assuming the researcher is Christian to begin with, would tend to have a relatively simplistic view of conversion and deconversion. It would tend to describe these events as a sort of spiritual process under divine guidance, as described in the Bible. This cripples conversion research at the outset, and certainly doesn't reflect the social and psychological forces which heavily play into the process. Under the levels of explanation view, the spiritual or supernatural workings, if there be any, behind conversion and deconversion may operate at their level as an explanation, but allows for other areas of research to function independently to describe the process and behaviors. The 2014 Oxford Handbook of Religious Conversion, curated by Louis R. Rambo, is probably the most extensive collection of research on religion conversion between two covers, numbering just under 1,000 pages. It contains independent contributions from neurologists, anthropologists, psychologists, behaviorists, theologists, and a dozen other fields of research. Each one offers an insight specific to their field, without which a full picture of religious conversion would be close to impossible. This is the very definition of levels of explanation. So what may we conclude? There are several different schools of thought in terms of how Christianity ought to interact with psychology, ranging from discarding with psychology as a science altogether to conduct psychology entirely under the roof of the church. Religious conversion research, although it sounds very ingrained into religious belief, is anything but. In order to study conversion and deconversion objectively, one must not presuppose a particular religious view or dogma as the correct view. If the research shows that one particular system of religion stands as unique from others in terms of how people flow in and out of that practice, that requires examination. And the driving explanation might, in fact, be divine in nature, but one does not assume that in advance in order to get somewhere in studying it. Finally, if conversion research were only ever to function in tandem with Christianity, it wouldn't be functionally different from theology. It would not be able to interact with research or conversation in the larger academic world. By its very nature, conversion research exists to see what conversion looks like under different levels of explanation. Does a person's neurology alter during or after conversion or deconversion? Does the person transition through distinct behavioral states as they convert or deconvert? Does the conversion process have a distinct beginning and end, or does it continue on into the person's religious life, as suggested by Gurin? All of these questions deserve examination independently before they are incorporated into some other level of explanation.